about that in just a second. Okay.
You're muted, Lisa.
I don't know why I keep getting muted. I'm sorry. I'm not doing that on my own. Hi, welcome. We're very excited to have 4 of our esteemed colleagues to talk about digital dissertations, and at the event we're calling Digital Futures. It's meant to be a roundtable conversation. We are delighted that so many people have been interested in this conversation. And in particular, the reason that we're having this event is that it is the culmination of many efforts by the students who are part of GC Digital Initiatives as GC Digital Fellows to start to formalize and think about what are the requirements, what are the kinds of considerations that students and faculty should give to the creation of a digital either component or wholly digital dissertation project as the culminating scholarly project of the degree for the doctorate. So what we would like to do today is I'm going to introduce each of our speakers. I'm going to introduce our 3 digital fellows who are going to be asking some questions that we've put together in advance. We're going to begin the conversation just within that sort of group, and then we're going to extend the conversation a little more broadly and allow questions from the audience as well. So we'd like to make sure that we have plenty of time for all of those things. Just a little bit of a background. Digital dissertations have been around for about 20 years at this point. The first one I happen to remember personally is Matt Kirschenbaum's digital dissertation, which was called Lines for a Virtual Typology or Typography, depending on how you spell it. It included 5 electronic essays on artifice and information and aesthetics. And that was submitted to the University of Virginia as part of both his PhD in English and as a student at IATH, the Institute for Advanced Topics in Digital Humanities. So following that kind of event, I remember there being lots and lots of conversation. There have been, I believe, Media Commons, 2 volumes dedicated to thinking about digital dissertations. In 2015, the George Mason University's Department of History created a group of guidelines for the program, some of the first that we had seen that were official program guidelines for completing a digital dissertation. More recently, there was an event at Syracuse around digital dissertations and alternative forms of dissertation production. And recently, the Shaping the Digital Dissertation book that just recently came out from Open Books, in which one of our speakers, Kathleen Fitzpatrick, has a chapter. So I'm going to begin by introducing the speakers because you didn't come to listen to me and they have much more interesting things to say. So Dr. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is the Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University. She's written extensively about the future of academic publishing, including addressing key social and institutional issues to ensure that scholarly communications remain relevant in the digital future. And she is the establishing director of Humanities Commons. Dr. Marisa Parham is Professor of English and Digital Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she directs the African American Digital and Experimental Humanities Initiative. And she is also Associate Director of the Maryland Institute for Technology and Humanities. As the current chair of the ACLS Commission on Fostering and Sustaining Diverse Digital Scholarship, she's leading discussions on systems and institutional change and providing equitable access to the creation and sustainability of digital resources and projects related to social and racial justice. Dr. Sohini, is a comics maker based in New York. She has a PhD from Stony Brook University, where she drew her doctoral dissertation, Drawing Unbelonging, as a comic. The project was supported by a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation and the American Council of Learned Society. In both her creative and academic work, Kay focuses on how comics can be utilized by scholars and artists alike in healthcare justice, in environmental humanities, in resisting disinformation, and in espousing an equitable future for all. Her debut graphic memoir, Unbelonging, is slated to be published by Penn State University Press in fall 2023. Dr. Zoe LeBlanc is an assistant professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois. She currently serves on the editorial board of Programming Historian and is on the executive committee of the Association for Computers and the Humanities. Her dissertation was the first digital history dissertation at Vanderbilt, and she used computational methods to analyze archival sources and craft historical arguments. So we are also excited that our three of our GC Digital Fellows, Dee Yoon, who is a PhD student in critical and social personality psychology, Nicole Coate, who is a PhD student in English, and Zach Lloyd, who is a PhD student in comparative literature, will be guiding and fostering the conversation. So I will turn things over to you all.
Hi, everyone. So we're actually going to have the speakers introduce their work and a little bit about, how they come into the digital dissertation before we get started with some of the questions. And then in the meantime, as the roundtable discussion is going along, please feel free to add questions into the chat, and we will share them with the speakers as they come up. So we'll go by alphabetical order, if that's okay with everybody. And in that case, Kathleen, you're up first.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. I'm super excited about it. This is an area of deep interest of mine in thinking about what becomes of the dissertation as we move increasingly into a world in which scholarly outputs don't just look like journal articles and monographs, in which there are many, many other possibilities. That having been said, I wrote an old school dissertation, which got turned late 20th century. So I do not have direct experience myself of producing one of these documents, but I have guided several of them, and documents that are quite different one from another. I have had one dissertation writer who has used computational methods in doing the research for a dissertation, which ultimately took textual form. I've had another dissertation writer who did a digital edition and then had a written component that went alongside it. I've had one dissertation writer who produced a video game and then had a written component that introduced the video game, and then several others beyond that. And I think one of the things that's exciting about the potentials that a digital dissertation presents is that it can be a testing ground for the kind of work a scholar wants to do beyond the PhD, right? Thinking about what could be possible for the scholarship that they want to produce. The one thing that, I'm hoping that we will get to in this conversation is that these things are hard to sketch out in the beginning. They take the shape they take as they go. And so producing that prospectus at the beginning, the prospectus of a dissertation has always been something of a fiction, right? You think at the beginning, what shape the project is going to take, and it changes from there as you go. But that is even more true in the digital dissertation. And so thinking about how to create a prospectus that can be as flexible and capacious as the project wants it to be, and yet at the same time not overburden the dissertator with expectations for what the final project is going to turn out to be, is, I think, a balancing act. So I'm going to leave it there for the moment, and we'll look forward to digging into the comments and questions as we go.
Thank you. And Kay, you're up next. I'm really like pleased that with alphabetical order, we get faculty and like recent grad faculty and recent grad. That works out really well.
Okay, so hi, I'm Kay. My dissertation, which I finished a few months back, summer 2022, it's called Drawing on Belonging. And I use comics as a medium of inquiry to engage the socio-political through the lens of the personal, and to kind of like just critically look at the pressing issues of our time. So I look at climate change, I looked at COVID-19, and stuff. So I suppose it's digital in the sense that I drew it entirely on my tablet, like my iPad on a drawing software. And I combined memoir and visual narrative with data visualizations. The aim was to appeal to both the emotional and the
Hey, did we lose you? I think Kay might have frozen, so it's possible she'll have to log out and then log back in again. So do we want to move on to the next person and then come back to Kay? So Marisa?
Hi, everyone, and thank you. Just wave wildly if you don't hear me or something. Though I'll probably start waving back, so that'll be awkward, but alas, I'm really glad to be here. But thank you very much. I guess sort of pertaining to the question, I was thinking a little bit even just as Kay was talking, thank you, as Kay was talking just now, sort of what I would like to see when I've been thinking about, and I'll say a little bit about my own work as well, is sort of thinking about opportunities that allow for, as Kathleen was saying, sort of flexible perspectives work, and also thinking about digital work on the sort of path to digital dissertation. Because I was thinking, something I see very often, not disparaging at all, it's my job to work with people and to help them learn things, but the numerous ways in which sometimes people are coming to digital dissertations without having done other kinds of digital work. And it's not a problem in the sense of, oh, well, you don't do digital, so how can you do digitals? I don't quite mean like that, because it's not quite the same thing where it's like, me trying to draw a dissertation is like, I can't even draw stick people. It's not quite that, right? It's not a talent or anything else question. But if we're going to really thinking about the sort of numerous ways that digital work transforms how we ask questions, right? That's a process. And getting people to the place where they can do digital work in ways that really bespeak their questions, that really bespeak their interests, takes time, right? So this is just yet another, I think in terms of what Kathleen was saying, there's such a sense of, I think this is exactly right, of the flexible perspectives, but also understanding that you have to move away in certain ways from the end product in order to get the end product that you want. And so what does that look like in structures where everything is so regimented, right? And I have real questions about the regimentation, especially as in general, so many graduate programs become smaller. So much of that regimentation is also just sort of tied to the management of numerous people of numerous interests. And I'm not quite sure it quite works that way anymore. So that's a sidebar, but I do want to say that out loud. And part of why I'm also so centered on, I forgot to start my timer. One reason why I'm also so structured or thinking so much about dissertation work as a process in relation to digital is that the place where I live, both in helping people with dissertations and also a thing I want to enter into this because a lot of my work, undergraduate digital theses as well, thinking about like honors theses, et cetera, master's theses alongside that, is thinking about, and I mentioned those two things, by the way, the undergrad and the MA thesis digital work as well, because they're often on far shorter timelines. And so that's when a lot of this really comes into play in a way that's very obvious, whereas a dissertation, for better or for worse, there's kind of a languishing moment, various languishing moments, and those get absorbed over time. Whereas when you're in that far shorter timeline, you really see the kinks in the process, right? There's really kind of stopping places in the process. And in terms of my own work, this is important because I live somewhat more on the ELIT side of digital work. I do computational work, but computational creative interpretive work. And so thinking also then about the numerous kinds of exposure one needs to be able to ask new questions actually means exposure to the technology. But how do you do that with people who have, in many ways, often so little time, right? That's a really long way of saying, and I think historically it's been true for various structural and technical reasons. But if we want to move away from the idea of a digital dissertation as a sort of, really fancy PDF, right, which isn't bad, but it's a particular kind of thing, then we have to also think differently about what constitutes digital writing. And, rhetoric programs, writing programs, like all kinds of programs are doing this, to be really clear. But I guess what I'm sort of getting at is, where do we locate the sort of synthetic moment, right, where these various kinds of skills and these various approaches and also the time to learn can really come to play? It means integrating more kinds of digital work into graduate courses, for instance, because we have to find the places with the low stakes engagement. Right. I guess it's a very long way of saying also that the place of high stake engagement, the dissertation, from my perspective, can't necessarily be the first side of engagement. Right. And so what does that look like? How do we think about it? And also, and why I mentioned a sort of ELIT thing, thinking about the digital, and it's very true with the comics dissertations. It's very true. I'm thinking of A.D. Carson, who did an album as a dissertation, right? So sort of just thinking about, again, what that process looks like and how it's a real opportunity, particularly from people from marginalized communities, but other communities as well, to really find new forms that actually bespeak the level and kinds of interest they carry, right? There's a way in which part of the promise of digital extends beyond a sort of, and I think we're past this, like, oh, it's new, it's just different, right? Into really thinking it was a mechanism for something to really blow open what we even think of as knowledge production. But to be able to get there, we have to think very differently about the process through which we come to dissertations. So the takeaways from that is more time, more process, and never forgetting that when we're thinking about digital, even the question of rigor, even the question of inquiry, matters of research, we're also still talking about creative processes. And so how do we honor that, I guess, when we're thinking about dissertations as well? I'll just stop there.
Thank you. And we'll definitely dive into a lot of those questions and points that were brought up in both of your introductions so far. But Kay is back. And so I would like Kay to introduce herself and her amazing graphic dissertation. Someone actually shared the link to her site, and it's a sneak peek to what would be, I'm guessing what would be part of the publication. But yes, please.
I have no idea. My Wi-Fi never does that, but but yeah, I actually really love the idea of low stakes digital exploration, because that's kind of what I did. I started out with a comics dissertation in the footsteps of Nexus Annis, who did Unflattening for Harvard University Press. And that was kind of my inspiration. So I really wasn't thinking about anything digital until I really got into it. And I realized that in comics, not only can you combine images and text, but also numbers. And I needed numbers because a lot of my stories were actually personal, and to connect it to the larger societal issues, I needed data. And that's where I realized that I can really easily incorporate creative data visualizations in my work. And that's how I went to, I started learning Tableau and just dealing with data visualization. It just kind of really opened up my medium, because A, it was new, and B, it was something that I hadn't expected before, and my advisors were really excited about it. So yeah, I really like the idea of just exploring and seeing where it takes you. But yeah, so sorry for getting disconnected before.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll hear more from you and your perspective, especially with thinking about connecting, because you are in English, or you graduated in with a PhD in English, right? Yeah. And so it's interesting to hear also, right, to connect numbers for a humanities scholar that I don't think is too common, maybe. This is from a social scientist, so I may be projecting as well.
I would say you're right. You're actually probably right. Yeah. And I actually had to learn because last time I did any math was in high school. So, but yeah, you can learn.
Great. And we have our last panelist, Zoe, if you could please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm just going to echo thank you so much for putting this roundtable together and for inviting me. This was the kind of event I probably could have used maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. So hopefully this helps someone not make some of the mistakes I did. I got my PhD in history from Vanderbilt in 2019, and history generally, I think, as a humanities discipline, can tend towards more kind of conservatism when it comes to these things, or at least that was my experience. So I was not in a program that had a lot of kind of investment in DH. This wasn't George Mason. This wasn't, Stanford. It was pretty much me kind of on my own. I came into the program kind of generally interested in computers, but that was kind of like my hobby at night. I was like, day job, going to be a historian, not the most probably financially smart decision, but somehow it worked out. And so about midway through my program, I became really, really fascinated about the opportunities that digital history were kind of opening up for doing kind of scholarship and teaching. And I chatted with Mickey Kaufman, who I'm sure everybody on this call knows their work, but just an amazing digital history scholar who has this great digital dissertation called Quantifying Kissinger. And she kind of gave me this moment of permission to say, if you want to do this, you can do it. And so that was my first, kind of seed moment of thinking, maybe I could bring in some digital something into the dissertation. But I had a bit of a rude awakening, because at the time, there was certainly examples of digital dissertations, but a lot of the digital history projects I was interested in emulating were, I learned kind of as I was going deeper, usually done by kind of teams of people, right? Usually with a tenured prof, and not graduate students. So I was trying to kind of reverse engineer projects to see how they did things, but also realize that the kind of resource and support they had was not something I would be able to marshal as a graduate student, right? I couldn't hire someone to do a bunch of work on this project. So I ended up enrolling in a coding boot camp in Nashville because I wanted to learn how to do this stuff. It mattered to me, and it was part-time. So in my head, I was like, oh, this will be fine. I can just do it on the side somehow. Probably getting the sense I'm bad at time management, which is true to this day. But yeah, that was a really helpful experience because as everyone on the call has talked about, it's very difficult to get kind of deep technical competencies within a humanities graduate program still. So that is what helped me kind of build that foundation. It was in web development, not data science, which it turned out was what I needed to learn, actually. So my dissertation is on kind of the information politics of the third world, specifically looking at Cairo. And I was really interested in these kind of magazines that were produced from Cairo in particular, and then comparing them to other kind of third world hubs. And so I ended up building a web application to essentially, so I literally scanned all these magazines, then built a web application to be able to extract the data from them. So things like images, text, and then had to learn computational methods, which was wildly more work than I expected. So tried everything kind of from word embeddings to topic modeling, ended up doing a lot of kind of regression analysis. And by that point, as you can imagine, I was running out of time on the dissertation clock. I was also working full-time as a DH developer at the Scholars Lab. And so I ended up defending the dissertation, but it wasn't fully digital in that my committee, that I had to argue with them pretty vigorously to get the kind of machine learning, computational work, data curation work included. And at that point, I think it was just too far a step to say, could you also review this in a digital space? They didn't feel comfortable giving me notes on a kind of web page, right? And so that's kind of how my intro to digital dissertations, that's my kind of trajectory, I guess. In the end, I can report that like they were actually very excited by the computational work. For anyone on the call that's kind of considering it, they wanted more graphs by the end, which I was surprised by. But I do wish it had been digital because there was a lot of issues with kind of, things like how to print the graphs and have enough graphs to explain what's going on versus letting people just interact with the data. So yeah, I'll stop there because I know we have a lot more questions and stuff, but hopefully that's a helpful background.
Thank you. That's really great as an introduction to kind of a lot of the topics and questions that we have. And I've been taking notes too, so that I can come back to it if we missed anything. And then also, as what Lisa said, like please feel free to add your questions to the chat, and we will take notes of them. So don't worry if conversation starts going in the chat. So the very first question actually is, and all of you have kind of spoke about it a little bit, but what forms might digital dissertations take? We mentioned comics as one form in which it take, and then Zoe, you mentioned a little bit about computational methods. So, while it is still submitted as a PDF, there are digital components, and that qualifies as a digital dissertation, perhaps, right? And so, if folks could, maybe especially for Kathleen and Marisa, like in your experience, right, the different forms and different kind of projects that you have seen that folks have taken their digital dissertations to. And then to that point as well, how do people get started, right? Like where can they start including the low stakes digital exploration in their work? I know you mentioned a little bit about having that be part of the curriculum, right, from the faculty perspective. But, say, for example, a student wants to initiate something, what might be a good kind of direction, I think, to get us started in the discussion. And, okay, yes,
I
Kathleen,
just love this moment. Do we defer or like
waiting to
death
see
match?
who unmutes first? Yeah, exactly.
Kathleen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just say a few quick things. I mean, as I mentioned, I've worked with grad students who have done digital dissertations that have taken radically different shapes one from another. One of my graduate students produced a video game that was designed to teach about video games, right? So this is just my
Kathleen, I don't know about others, but I think you're coming across.
Who is now at
Kathleen,
oh shoot, did I break up?
Yeah, you might need to turn off your video. There you go.
Okay, how's that? Yeah, it's now popping up and telling me that my internet connection is unstable, which, duh. Anyway, so Justin Weigart, who's at University of Richmond, did a dissertation in which he produced a video game that was designed to function like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, right? To provide a digital walkthrough of video game history and theory so that students could learn about video games in the process of playing it. He wrote a kind of thesis that was a written component that went alongside this. But the video game was the core of the project. And he had started working on that project several years before the actual dissertation point took off, right? He had started sketching out modules for it as part of our DH methods course. He had started working on it as part of a fellowship that he had the year after that. And so it was a project that started for him while he was still in coursework and then folded into his dissertation as he went. And I think in some ways that's a really excellent model for the ways that a digital dissertation might evolve out of what Marisa was referring to as that low stakes learning process. process, right? In which he was able to kind of figure out the pieces of what he needed to learn before the moment at which we said, okay, you've got a year and a half, go. Right. So there was a whole lot of groundwork that had been laid. I'll stop there and see what else we want to talk about. So, Marisa.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think when even thinking sort of systematically, this is probably actually just a version of the process you've just laid out, and thinking about it from a sort of beginning place. Right, just thinking about scaffolded approaches to learning new technologies. And the big thing I've been emphasizing across my courses, both graduate and undergraduate, frankly, is producing sort of digital, like finding a single question, or I'll say, for instance, even just take like, one page of a paper you've already written, right? And so kind of working with the thing you kind of already have and have a handle on. Right? Because one thing that's difficult about navigating digital work at a high level of production is that it's sometimes difficult to know when you're hitting a stopping place or a difficult place because the question is hard or because you're not quite approaching it the right way, or, all the things that happen in research, or if it's just because this damn like mouse over effect doesn't work. There's a way in which all those things can become a little bit of a swirl. And so I emphasize as much as possible putting aside some time for experimentation, but to focus that experimentation again on extant writing. So that way you kind of already know what's good and bad about the writing, or what works and doesn't work about the writing, or what you even hate about the writing. You use a piece of writing you hate and you want to rehabilitate it, for example, right? I've actually gotten a lot of mileage out of that process for myself. Like when I can't write, I go back to something I actually don't like and I fumble with it in new digital forms, and hopefully something new emerges, right? That kind of challenge, it works for me. But the point is, there are different kind of challenges that anyone can set up for themselves. But sort of taking these moments as parts of labs or just with a group of friends, I really mean it, and just sitting and playing with what you already have, right? And this takes a little bit of the pressure off of, and I'm kind of over answering, but I think it takes a lot of pressure off of the sort of notion of a particular kind of final product, right? And it might very well be the case that as you're doing that, you're like, wait a minute, this can help me answer this question, or wait a minute, there's actually a dissertation thing I was thinking that maybe I could use this for, right? So there's a way in which, again, focusing as much as possible on separating out skills, exposing oneself to new kinds of skills, and also making sort of as much as possible kind of rational decisions around when you need to forge ahead with new work in order to acquire a skill versus when you might want to use stuff that you already have in your wheelhouse and under control as a launching point for learning something new. So I'll just say that to add sort of to what Kathleen was saying, because again, I'm still thinking, Zoe, also about some of the stuff that you were saying, that where to start question, anything I think to make that more organic and to let that process be longer, I think is just useful.
Should I jump in, or does Kay want to, or okay? I think this is a great question of kind of like what forms can a digital dissertation take? I mean, part of it is, I think what we're getting at here is we need to kind of disambiguate what digital means a little bit, right? I think so often when we use it, it's kind of like on a form marking like the other category, right? Like it's just such an expansive bucket of what can go into it. And a lot of it has to do with kind of disciplinary and institutional norms, right? So, now that I'm in an I school, a lot of the work that I was trying to do is completely normalized and isn't really called a digital dissertation. It's just a dissertation, right? Which has been an interesting kind of shift for me to navigate. So I think part of it is thinking about what we mean here and how much what we're doing is navigating kind of pushing the conventional normative space, right? What counts as scholarship. In terms of like forms and formats I've seen, some have been kind of digital websites, some have been things like scalar sites. One thing I would say in terms of advice is, yes, you need I couldn't agree more with everything Marisa and Kathleen has said so far, like time for experimentation, support in these kinds of things. One thing I wish I had done was more kind of building institutional buy-in and building and kind of helping my committee like work through what this project was going to be, because I underestimated how much this was outside of the boundaries in some ways, right? So the more earlier on you can do that, and hopefully you're at an institution where there's support for this work, right? The hard thing is if you're at an institution where you're really kind of doing this on your own, you're going to be fighting a lot of battles that have really nothing to do with your scholarship and more about kind of changing institutional cultures. So, if you can find allies on campus who can advocate for what you're doing, who can, use their kind of social capital as a way so that, because, as a graduate student, you already have so much limited time and so many demands on your time and also not a lot of institutional power. So I guess that would be my sense. Was that the question? I feel like I maybe combined a bunch of thoughts, but I'll pass it to Kate now.
I would really just kind of like second everything that Zoe said, because I find that humanities scholarship is often seen as such a solitary exercise, and that's not good for us. But the reason I really found my experience to be so fun and so generative is because I was constantly surrounded by really smart and creative people who were really kind about my work at a time when my work wasn't that good, because I was just starting out. I was trying to learn. I was trying to learn how to draw. I was trying to learn how to actually combine data with images. It wasn't very good, but I was surrounded by this really cool community of people who cheered me on, and that helped so much. Just brainstorming ideas help us. So the funny part is a lot of this brainstorming and just finding a community happen on Twitter, which is nowadays dumpster fires. So I don't know. I kind of like do not know an alternative to that right now. But I would really say just finding a community and good mentors who will just support your work and just help you through trial and help you just work through trial and error is just so important in pursuing different dissertations.
Thank you so much for all of those points. I kind of have a question that bounces off many of the things Zoe's been talking about. I'm sort of in everyone, but I think Zoe's been touching on this quite a bit, is approaching committees and advisors. And so for folks who've completed these dissertations, I'm kind of wondering what was your strategy for approaching your committee, your advisors, and then for folks who've supported them, what would you want someone to approach you with? What kind of ideas or advice would you give people trying to start this work?
I can go first, maybe. So I think my strategy is a cautionary tale. I essentially gave my advisor an ultimatum. I was either going to have this in my dissertation or I wasn't going to defend. And that was my intellectual stakes. I just felt very strongly that this was the work I wanted to be doing. And luckily, he's a very sweet person, did not take offense at that. But I made it very clear that this was the only way I felt comfortable moving forward with the project. Now, again, I don't think that's a good approach. Ideally, you would know that you want to do this earlier on, and that kind of consensus building could be very useful. But at the time, like, it was still relatively new. In terms of now being on the, I've been on some dissertation committees now that involve a lot of computational work, a lot of what might be considered a digital dissertation. I think just more communication and definitely thinking about the types of feedback that can be both technical and kind of substantive. And that's kind of a false binary there, right? Like, obviously the two go together, but I think so often committees are used to engaging with the kind of content, but not the form. And oftentimes you need that kind of feedback as well of, like, whether it's a method, whether it's a kind of layout, these kinds of things. So I try to give kind of both.
So I'll hop in, and I'm going to turn off my video just to make sure that the audio stays as stable as I can. Just to say that from the other side, from the directing a dissertation, I really want to echo what Zoe has said. That process of creating consensus is basically a process of mentoring up, right? Of finding among your advisors and your committee members the folks who can help you as you're working toward developing a new structure for your dissertation, and getting them on your side, figuring out how they can help you make the case to anybody that needs to have a case made for them. Starting those conversations as early as possible, so that it doesn't come as a shock when you say, darn it, I'm going to have this digital component to my dissertation, right? You don't have to have an ultimatum at that point because everybody has known this all along. And so in some ways, I mean, it becomes like this adds an extra layer of responsibility to someone who is producing a dissertation. And that's unfortunate. But he part of the process, I think, to sort of teach your advisors how to read what you need to get the kind of student and the material and
Kathleen, I think you're breaking up again. So we want to hear what you have to say. Maybe in a minute or two, you'll get a better connection. And it might help to maybe reinforce what you just said in the chat. Marisa, did you want to follow up or?
Yeah, I had a short follow-up. I'm still picking up some what I've got from Kathleen and also thinking about Zoe's point about team building. Also, I mean, it is, I don't know, everything's a burden. Because, it's an increased burden, on the dissertation writer to do this. But at the same time, some of that increased burden is also just increased responsibility, which sometimes makes work easier. I'm on the fence, I go back and forth, like catch me on Wednesday, I'll have a different thought. But, what the sort of responsibility and burden, what it means and how it plays out. But I think on the student side, learning to think real broadly also about what constitutes or who constitutes your team. And if these people are everywhere, there's a way in which what I love about digital work, and I'm actually somewhat of a solitary worker myself, to be clear. So I think a lot about this, like just by disposition. I'm a very solitary worker, actually. So the things I've had to learn and unlearn and refuse to let go of, but also change, et cetera, have been really always the forefront of my mind. I'm deeply introverted, the whole sort of thing, right? And so there's a way in which, and I bring up the introversion thing, which is not a very introverted thing to say. I bring it up because some of this too is figuring out where for you as a scholar, your boundaries lie, right? One, and two, also thinking about how the process is a process that's supposed to help you expand those boundaries. And that also the expansion of those boundaries also by default, ideally helps us expand the boundaries, not just around the question of what constitutes an academic question, but who's included in an academic question. So I'm thinking that when I've had undergrad or master theses, actually I haven't worked with a video games dissertation yet, but even for my own work, it's a great place to bring in all kinds of people because you need play testers. You actually need people who are going to sit there and just click everything until they fall asleep every night, and all the social work and all the things you need to do to get them to even be willing to do that. To be able to look at your images, to help you with this, to help you with that. And all those people actually have thoughts on the work, right? And so there's a way in which it's easy to imagine that when you're constituting a team around your work, you're constituting people according to their expertise. You're thinking from an implementation perspective, but also understanding that all those people who are implementing, the people who are helping you digitize, the people who are doing all this work also have thoughts, right? And so it kind of forces, and it's like a duh, right? But we get very kind of tunnel vision sometimes. And so it becomes a really important way to understand how many people care about your work, how many people care about scholarship in general, and to really kind of broaden a sense of inclusion around scholarship, which I think in all this is really critical. And frankly, right, there's a way in which it also ideally can force, and I'll say this now as someone on the other side, I'm on the committee side or advisor side, there are times, for instance, when I work with students on projects, and often I step back on the conceptual side after a certain point. I just work as a developer. I'm going to sit with you and help you pound out this thing. I'm actually a developer, right? So there's a way in which it's been interesting to me even watch them cope with that shift in role, right? Because at some point I have to say, like, look, if you need me doing something else, you need to tell me. And you can see their faces like, I don't really tell you what to do. And I'm like, well, you're going to need to tell me what to do, right? And there's a way in which those kinds of moments of shifting boundaries and those moments of kind of shifting responsibility and kind of shifting relationship are really helpful, again, to the idea of creativity and really helpful to the idea of scholarship. So I just wanted to sort of say that out loud because, one, you never know who can actually help you until you ask. And so exposing your work to the highest number of people on digital is really helpful. That you don't have to always only look at people who are in your subject area, because going back even to this kind of form and content point, there are people, like I got immense help in some of my work from people who are in architecture, for example, because the ways they were thinking about the kinds of things I was thinking about in terms of the infrastructure for a project are similar to how they think about their work. And I never realized that, blah, blah, blah. You see what I'm getting at, right? So again, really reaching around and really developing community around your work in the ways in which those community people often become invested in the infrastructure. And it helps break down some of the, I'm also thinking, Zoe, again, sorry, about your point about the sort of ultimatum. That's also the responsibility moment. So there's a way in which you get to become that person much earlier in the process, right? In a way that I think just really matters. So I'll just stop there. And I'm sure it's a very kind ultimatum, or very but again, that's that moment you have to step up and you realize that, like, you're a person with a thing and you care about your thing and you're going to stand up for your thing, right? So how do we make that a more organic process?
So kind of just to follow up with some of these questions, and from what I'm seeing in the chat as well, I think there's a kind of elephant in the room sort of question when it comes to thinking about digital dissertations, which is about sustainability and like the future and maintenance of your work, especially when technologies are changing, they're going obsolete very quickly. Maybe in 10 years, like the very platform that you use to, I don't know, compile your data or pull your data from might not even exist anymore. In many ways, you're kind of like beholden to these very proprietary frameworks or software, all these sorts of things that kind of allow you to do this kind of work, but then you're very much tied to those platforms and like sustaining it. So I just kind of wonder how you all think about sustaining the work that you do going forward, and how do you like account for the ever sort of shifting nature of the technologies that you're working with.
Zoe, do you want to start? Because all Zoe and I do is talk about sustainability of digital work.
Yeah, pretty much. Although it's mostly me listening to you, Marisa, because you have so many brilliant things to say. This is a great question. I think this helps encapsulate for me, like, the hard thing with digital dissertations is you are at the kind of site of so many broader questions in scholarly infrastructure, right? And at the same time, you have so much fewer resources or institutional kind of power. And so it's this weird moment where you're pushing the boundaries without the kind of institutional support. Sorry, that's like a bigger point here, and I just want to say it out loud. In terms of sustainability, this is a great question. We haven't really figured this out for digital scholarship writ large, right? One of my friends and co-authors on this forthcoming chapter in Debates in DH, which Matt is editing and edited at this point, I think, talked about her experience of doing a fully digital dissertation. This is Jerry Waringa, and having to submit it, to essentially not being able to submit most of the code to ProQuest, right? So like even the structures intended to sustain our dissertations don't really work well with digital dissertations. I'll say for myself, the web app I built, I did a talk last summer where I demoed it, and I hadn't realized, but the web framework I built it in, AngularJS, the version I built it in is now deprecated. Like, it's no longer being supported. It's essentially obsolete, right? So like, and that was in 2017 I built it. So like the pace of tech change and the kind of social dynamics of that are really intense, and it's really hard because you have to make these choices where you're like, okay, I'm going to invest in this platform, this skill, this technology, but you don't know if 5 years down the road that's actually going to be supported in the same way. So I think it's a personal choice in some ways of where you want to put your time. There's nothing like, you can use off the shelf tools, like all those things. And maybe the key thing is you have your data in a kind of interoperable kind of format, right? Maybe you use Markdown, maybe you use spreadsheets or something else to kind of deal with that. But I would just emphasize, this is not something that's been figured out for like the field as a whole. So like, don't expect that whatever solution you come up with is going to be the definitive answer.
I think that's exactly right. And again, trouble for this, but I stand by it, which is also, it's two things. You have to think really hard about it, and also don't think too much about it. There's a way in which, and I struggle with this as a commissioner of a digital sustainability commission a lot, because if you overthink the matter of the future sustainability, it might hold you back from what you need to do in the moment. And it's hard to think about, right? And I think the key word in what Zoe was saying, there's many keywords, but the key term to sort of take away if it's newer for you is this idea of interoperability. So even my most like dramatic, performative, digital, experimental projects, they're actually just backed up to a spreadsheet somewhere where I have the HTML version, the text version, a screenshot, and the finished version of every page and every movement of these things, right? And so there's a way in which one thing that can actually be helpful, and I'm going to, again, over answer from an implementation perspective, one thing that's really helpful is to actually think about sustainability from an archival perspective, which is, in my sort of down the ground but / layman's way, it's just keep everything in places that later on can become other things. I'm in the middle right now of a project that's coming from its 10-year anniversary, Black Constant Anthropocene, that I'm just remaking it. But when I first made it, I made it in WordPress, which I don't even use for most things, but it was something I had to get done. I wrote it in like a week, right? I had very little time. Even though I know web development, I used WordPress. I knew it when I did it, sort of what I was signing up for in terms of bad sustainability, but I simply made archival versions of the entire site. And because I was able to do that, it's very easy now for me just to pour it over to a new infrastructure. And a new infrastructure will probably look like the original, to be clear, right? And it's not so like, haha, look at this. It really is maybe that simple. I think one way or one approach to the question also, I'll say from an institutional perspective, is rethinking a little bit about in the future what it's going to look like to archive digital projects, because the archiving of digital projects has to be thought of as an ongoing process. It's not a one and done in the same way, right? And I think that's sort of key to this, because at some point, right, we have to imagine a world where you have version 1 of a dissertation, and then in 10 years, when you update the project or it becomes something closer to a book and et cetera, even if it were still digital, be able to go back and say, I want to update this. I want to add a V2, right? And the standards for what that looks like, what's included in the V1 versus 2, the question, all down the line, we can answer these questions, right? Not blowing them off, but I find them as eminently answerable. And so this is a long way of saying to have a sense of how everything in your project can be saved, how as much as possible aspects of your project can be put into future interoperable forms, and then kind of let it go. Otherwise, you're going to hit a wall, because even despite what I said earlier, though I stand by it, around starting early to learn new digital forms and et cetera, you can't prognosticate. We don't know which platform is going to fail. We don't know who's going under. We don't know a lot of things, right? And there's a way in which imagining that you can control that part of the process is a little bit of a fool's game, right? So it's not so much saying like, be foolish and just do what you want, but kind of just do what you want. Just make sure you're doing what you want with a plan B always in mind, because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult to move forward, because even building a proprietary platform has no guarantees, right? I'm not sure I answered the right question, but yeah.
Did somebody else want to address the issue of sustainability? Or Kay or Kathleen?
Well, I would, oh, go ahead, Kay.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to add, I mean, first of all, a huge +1 to what Marisa was just suggesting about interoperability and about, the more, quite frankly, that you can keep the individual components of your dissertation as close as possible to plain text, the more portable they'll be in the future, right? So as, whatever it is that you can do to maintain those objects, the better off you'll be. But I wanted to add a thought about sustainability in a slightly different direction. And this is kind of building on a question that's in the chat right now about having to do all of this digital work and having to have brilliant ideas about your subject matter too, right? And doesn't that produce a whole lot of extra labor? It's absolutely true. It really does. And, as I mentioned with the dissertations that I've overseen, there's the dissertation writer who produced a digital edition and therefore had to learn TEI and had to do the research back behind producing that edition, and then wrote the component that made the argument for the work that she had done on the edition. Justin Weigard produced this game and then wrote the text component that went alongside the game. There is always this sense of dual labor that goes into these projects. What makes them, or what can help in making them sustainable, is making sure that you sort of see the long game in your project, that there is so much of the project that you will be able to complete as part of the dissertation, and there's likely going to be more that you're going to want to do after the dissertation is done. And thinking about where to draw that line and where to say this is how much goes into the dissertation and this is post-dissertation work is one of the things that can help make this a little bit more manageable in terms of the ability sort of to sustain your own energy and to sustain your own ability to keep working on this. So Justin, for instance, had imagined this, like 15 modules going into the game. And we ended up sort of together thinking through how much of those 15 modules was actually work he really needed to do for the dissertation and how much, in fact, should be done at some point later on when he's going to complete this project. Similarly, Amanda Visconti has shared with me their prospectus from their original dissertation, which turned into Infinite Ulysses, right? And their prospectus proposed 2 whole additional projects in addition to Infinite Ulysses. And they ended up scaling back as the project went on and realized, there was just no way it was going to be sustainable to do all of that work. So, and this is part of the thing that I was talking about earlier on with the prospectus and making sure that what you propose is itself doable. But along the way of the doing, there are going to be these decision points at which you're going to need to really kind of think about what is going to be possible for you now and what, in fact, you can make the argument for doing later.
Thank you. And Kay, I believe you had also something to share.
I was actually about to say something similar because I was not thinking of sustainability in terms of like longevity, which is very important, but I was thinking about it in terms of like what you can manage reasonably. And I don't know, like I got the ACLS fellowship, and without that, I really do not think I would have finished on time because I was at Stony Brook where we teach like 2 to 4 classes a year, and doing kind of like an innovative dissertation on top of that gets really hard. Because when you're doing something digitally or just something that is not like kind of like a monograph text-based project, you're not just focusing on the content, but also on the method. So it's two things, and you only have so many hours in the day, and you really have to know how to scale back and realize that the dissertation is not going to be the best work of your life, and save something for later. That's kind of like what I was going to say. So, but Kathleen explained it much better. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And just to kind of continue the conversation that Kay and Kathleen have kind of started, I would be really selfishly grateful if maybe other folks might talk about scope, managing scope, kind of like thinking about what this kind of project has to look like, or should look like, or might look like at this level, and then drawing those lines. That's kind of where I am personally. So I would be really grateful to hear anyone else's thought on scope. And
well, I could say a little bit. Again, I feel like I'm such a cautionary tale here. Like, just don't do what I did, and you will be in a much better spot. I think Marisa has already brought this up to a degree, but like one of the hard things with doing digital work, depending on how we define it, is that oftentimes you don't quite know what you're going to have with this. Like, you're learning as you do it, right? Which in some degree is true for all our scholarship, but we usually have a lot more kind of scaffolded support, right? Like, you take graduate seminars where you build on, this research, blah, blah, blah. And at least in my experience, there wasn't a lot of that kind of institutional support for this. So it was really hard to know the scope and to know what would make sense. One thing that can help a lot is finding models that are examples of the work you want to do. Now, of course, as Kathleen just said, like, the model is like looking at the output of somebody else obscures so many of the interpretive choices. So it might be better off to talk to them to find out what worked and what didn't work, but at least having some sense of the direction you're going helped me a lot. But again, there's things I would do incredibly differently. There's also one thing, what you can do with technology now versus when I was doing this work in like 2016, 2017 is radically different. So the hard thing too is you might look at a model and say, oh, I want to do a similar kind of project, but like you might end up still having to do a lot of experimental work because the way to do that now has changed substantially. Yeah.
I second that too, because talking to people who had done it before was such a huge help for me. Nick, who had done it on flattening before me, I actually ended up having him on my committee. And it was such a huge help to have somebody who had that practical experience. Our projects are very different, but it was still, like drawing a comic and using some digital methods. So there were some intersections and there were some divergences, but just having somebody who was going through it was an enormous help, and I cannot really recommend it enough. And the other advice for scope, I would say, is to get started a little ahead of time, because I remember thinking about this way before I started doing my dissertation, doing my coursework via independent studies, and just, like looking at other people's work and so on and so forth. And this really just helped me sort of understand how much I can handle, and just sort of like trying it out in pieces, because before I started drawing my dissertation, I was doing like illustrated essays for my seminars. So that kind of like helped me figure out like what I'm capable of and what I cannot do, and just explore and learn more through the process. So yeah.
So I'll just jump in with a question here. Something that really interests me personally and kind of goes against the grain of traditional sort of academic work. So like, how do you communicate this work that you do for this digital dissertation in whatever form it may take? Because it's not really something you can just send off to a journal and have published like you would typically do if you're just writing text, right? I know there's all these sort of requirements as an academic that you have, certain requirements to publish or to otherwise communicate your work in a way that is very public facing. So I wonder if you'll just have like some ideas or suggestions about how you go about communicating this work in an academic scholarly sort of way that also like does justice to the work itself. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that generally.
My sense is that the landscape does still suck. Is the exact right question. I was joking with someone once. They're like, I thought you'd publish more. But I'm like, I have lots of stuff, but almost nowhere can publish it. There's like 3 venues, maybe, for my work. It's real, right? Outside of self-publishing, and I've had to come up with new creative ways to get like peer review, for example. Real problems where publishers won't, because it's really difficult to do anonymous peer review when you're digital. There's a gazillion, or have anything kind of stands out in a certain way. Like I can imagine Kay having a similar problem. Like there's just a lot, right, to be clear, that's tied to this. And they point to larger structural questions that kind of need to be answered, not just taken for granted. I know Matt Gold, others have done amazing work around like open peer review. There's so many ways to answer the questions, but they do have to be answered. They need to be listed out and answered. And I think in terms of one thing I have learned, however, in terms of venue, et cetera, I'm going to give 2 different answers. I don't like the second one, but the first answer that I find helpful is looking to places for some of the work. This almost goes back to what I was saying about teams and community, looking for places like ELIT journals. There's all kinds of places that want to publish bits of our work. So for ourselves, breaking out of where we imagine academic work lives and who's interested in it, right? But this is for parts of things, right? So going back to that sense of like that kind of 3-page argument that you really love, and you realize all kinds of people could find this interesting. You don't have to necessarily only publish in an academic journal, right? The difficulty with this, of course, is that if you're thinking from a hiring perspective, a reappointment perspective, all the things, there are still certain kinds of academic credentials and credentialing that has to happen around the work. And that's the second part of my answer, which I appreciate and have grown from. Look at me, I'm an adult. I'm like, I appreciate and I have indeed grown from this, but I'm still kind of pissy about it, which is process piece and writing work about the work. I actually don't mind process piece, as if, it's not as if we don't have to be accountable, all the things, right? And be able to talk about our work. I just hate it because if you go back to the labor question, right? We're up now to not just double the labor, we're at triple the labor, right? Because you have to organize yourself, do the work, and then you got to do work about the work in order for the work itself to be legible, right? In new kinds of ways. But I do think through different kinds of informal writing, different kinds of process piece writing, there are ways, and this actually ties to the sustainability question, because one thing I did learn from the work I had to do around process piece writing about my digital work is that I had to be able to present the work differently, for instance, in a paper form, which had me thinking differently about the kinds of even snapshots to take of the pictures, snapshots of the work, right? It seems like a duh, like snapshots, but it actually kind of matters. I was looking at Roxanne's point in the chat, is what the word snapshot is sort of jumping out to me, about the snapshot representation of the work in the moment. There's a way in which the process piece actually need something similar. And that's really helpful as well as far as thinking about sustainability. But the short answer to what you're saying is that it's difficult to imagine a landscape. You have to make some of the landscape yourself, right? That's something we need to talk a little bit more about, how that's fair and unfair and a great opportunity, but also horrible. But also thinking about finding places and finding people in journals who are interested in the idea of the work, writing about that, and then just using, and again, I get too implementational because just who I am, but very low cost ways to host your own work online, so that while you're working, you have ways to show people the work, or even hosting small little bits of it and saying to, for instance, critical inquiry. We've talked about this a little bit where, social text, critical inquiry, I'm just thinking of journals that have online kind of blog presence, right? Those blogs aren't quite powerful enough to hold sort of substantial digital work, but at least it gives them an understanding of a place from which they can link to work, like the kinds of things you're thinking about. So for better or for worse, we have to also, I guess is a number 3, think about ways of enabling paper publishers to better use their digital resources to highlight and link to digital work that in fact already exists. Otherwise, the other thing we see happening, this was not your question, but because I'm pissy now, I'll say it, is thinking about the ways in which we have to be careful not to let digital scholarly work end up in the same bind that art so often ends up in, where you get the credit for talking about the thing and people love that you made the thing, but there's a way in which you're never able at the level of academic and other kinds of capital ever able to actually parlay that labor. The labor that in fact is valued is the writing about the work that someone else did. And that's the kind of bind that we want to make sure we're escaping, because that's what I see coming. There's a lot of power and cachet for talking about digital work, but still very little larger support for doing any kind of, I won't just say innovative, but just doing work outside of sort of representational platform work, which is incredibly important. Like I joke with the online PDF, I love that kind of work and it's critical and important to be doing it. But we also have to understand, again, the numerous ways that if we're being true to the question of digital work, it's going to come in all kinds of forms. So what is that going to look like? And again, I forgot the question, I'm sorry.
I think that's really great in like really answering the question about, thinking about publishing, but also addressing some of the questions in the chat about, how does that add to, like when you're hiring and on the job market? Because ultimately, when you graduate with a PhD, you hope to get a job and, pay off everything that you owe. But like, that's not always, I think Zoe mentioned in the response, right, in the chat, that the idea of a digital sprinkle is like advisors get excited about it, but don't always have a very clear perspective on what it is in the job market. And so like in relation to this question, for the other speakers who may have a response to it as well, I wanted to also ask if, in relation to the question on committees and stuff like that, the question about evaluation, and like earlier at the start of the conversation, we were talking about rigor and kind of guidelines, departmental guidelines and things like that with regards to evaluating the work. Because I think while advisors and faculty can be very excited, if they don't have the experience that Kathleen and Marisa has, right, then it becomes a question of how do I evaluate something that will fulfill the requirements of a conventional PhD format, but allow the students to explore. And I'm interested in hearing from both perspectives, right, from Zoe and Kay, and also from Marisa and Kathleen.
Well, I put this in the chat, but I can say a little more. Like, yeah, I think there is. Yeah, in this chapter we describe it as like an enthusiasm gap, where like people can be very excited for this work and think it's going to get you a job, but then actually looking at digital work and evaluating it, they are not into it, or like they want you to do it, but like on the side. I'm hoping this advice has changed, but when I was going through, so many people were just like, just do a traditional dissertation and you can do this exciting stuff once you have tenure, or do it on the side. And I was like, that is not the point. Like, which again, maybe explains why I came to the point of giving an ultimatum kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's hard because oftentimes these skill sets are seen as, diversifying for job market stuff, helping you do alt-ac. And I don't want to diminish it. Like it can absolutely do that, but I think it often gets overstated of how much easily transferable certain skills are, right? So my advice is usually don't do this work because you think it's going to get you a job. Do this work because you care about doing it. But yeah, it's tough. Like I think we're all trying to figure out what's happening to the humanities writ large in a kind of structural sense. And so I also understand the impulse of wanting to have something that you can come out and say, like, I can do X on my resume or CV. But yeah, I think in terms of what committees can do, like try to, even if you don't know how to do something, try and connect your student with someone that does. You have a lot of social capital that they don't have. Like a cold calling for a graduate student is such a higher lift than like you as a professor saying, I can connect you with this person. So that can help on the evaluation side instead of, again, as Kathleen described it, kind of mentoring up, which is what I think happens a lot.
I agree, because I think the key is to just recognize that there are ways of doing scholarship beyond the standard academic monograph. And I would say in the current humanities job market, it's not like if you do that, you're guaranteed a job either way. So like, why not just explore and do what you want and do what you like and do what you would likely excel at? That was my kind of approach going into it. I don't know how well it worked. I still get to do what I started out. So I guess that's kind of a good sign. But for what committees can do, I would say like, just use your networks to make sure that non-traditional approaches are seen as legitimate and funded in the same way as other approaches. And just, I don't know, like how would this be possible within the university kind of like infrastructure, but create more opportunities for it? That would certainly be a way forward, but yeah.
And there are I think that's exactly right. I think there are really ruthless sleights of hand. Frankly, my first tenure track job as an institution, it was very deeply and very proudly in that moment. This was in the past, unsupportive of digital work. My joke, that's not a joke, is I get this recognition, I get to do this work as a digital person, but I still remember sitting through my own third year reappointment meeting, sitting through a departmental meeting about how to best hide my digital work because they were so afraid it was going to sink me for tenure, right? So seeing that kind of sea change in the last like 15, or actually the sea change in the last like 7 years has been kind of shocking, but none of the structures have kept up with it, right? Which is part of why we're having this conversation this way today. So the ruthless sleight of hand that sort of kept me alive. Okay, it's way dramatic, but maybe it was that dramatic. It's hard to remember. I'm getting older, but it felt very dramatic in the moment. What kept me alive and thinking that I could stay in academia and do the kinds of work that I wanted to do was teaching. And that a lot of, and this also goes even to some of the human sustainability stuff that Kay and others were talking about earlier, which is, one way I've learned some of the newer stuff I do, I learned it through teaching it. And even though there's great ambivalence around still, where to publish digital scholarship, what it means, where it lives, will it change academia, all the things, right? There's a way in which, and I've ambivalence on what I'm saying, which I'm kind of stuttering through it, but the sort of market value of the skill sets you acquire through doing the work falls in teaching very clearly. It lands in teaching quite clearly, right? I don't love what I'm saying, but it's just true. And so there's a way in which one way this ties to the sustainability question, the human sustainability question, as I was mentioning, is, for instance, some of that scaffolding work of trying things out for yourself, do it through teaching, right? If you're teaching like your Intro to Comp course, do one small unit on digital writing, do one on interactive writing, there's all kinds of ways you could imagine, do one on comics writing, do one on storyboarding. There's all these ways you could imagine that the skills you find yourself exploring are also skills that your students benefit from exploring. And so then when it comes time to talk about your work at the level of the job market, you're talking about from the perspective of what you bring to the table, right? What makes you different, and also the ways in which you being added to the department, frankly, raises the department's profile in terms of their offerings. Again, I have ambivalence about this because I would love a world where digital work matters as digital work. But if you're thinking from a jobs perspective, that's the place where you'll find the capital. And at least the sort of parlaying of that capital can be helpful to your own scholarship, because at least you can somewhat combine the work of prep, as I did, with the work of exploration. It was very crass.
I don't think that was crass at all. I think that was exactly the thing that I think more of our departments need to be confronted by, because I'm telling you, every time, coming back to Zoe having been told, you can do all of this innovative, exploratory, exciting digital work after you get tenure. Every time I hear that, I die a little bit. I mean, it's a horror to think of how many scholars are being told to put the most exciting work they could possibly be doing off for some moment when it's supposedly safe. When we all know, quite honestly, by the time you get to tenure, people are stuck in their ways and they have figured out how to do the work they're doing, and they're going to keep doing the work they're doing because they've still got to go up for full at some point. And, it's a self-harming cycle that is utterly devastating for the field. I think the more that we can band together and can find the voices, whether it's within the institution or outside the institution, who can help make the argument that no, in fact, you need to be doing exactly the thing that you're proposing to do, precisely because it's the most exciting thing that can bring attention, not just to, your own personal work, but to, as Marisa says, the offerings that the department has, can bring students in to work with, that can attract other kinds of interest. I mean, I really think that we have to become a bit ruthless in that form of self-promotion and insisting that, that the work needs to be done the way that we want to do it. Now, it's all well and good for me to sit here and say that, of course, but I am here if anybody needs a voice to back up their arguments. So, know that there are people who you can reach out to for the support, in order to kind of make the dissertation into the project you want it to be.
Thank you. And thank you, Zoe, for being here and sharing with us. Really, really grateful for all that has been shared. It is 1:55, and I wish we could go on with these conversation and questions, because I think these are really important questions, and this is definitely something that requires a community of people. And as we have seen in this event, many of us come from many different places and have a lot of stakes in this event, and in also imagining a different field for dissertations. And so I really appreciate, and I think that if we could come together, there can be pressure to make some structural and fundamental shifts that can impact, long term, not just at the graduate student or PhD student level, but ultimately through alt-ac or tenure track jobs. I will now turn to Lisa to close us off. Thank you.
Well, so it's just, I think, very telling that we had so much to talk about, and we haven't even really been able to get through so many of the things that we wanted to discuss. So I'm gonna end by saying I think that there were a lot of very important takeaways that came out in today's conversation. This idea of making sure that there are more low-stake opportunities to experiment with digital scholarship, to play with different modalities before you get to the dissertation stage. That's really an important takeaway. The idea of working with materials you already have to produce things, thinking about sustainability, and in some ways not worrying over much about sustainability, to finding the communities of practice and helping them hold you up and hold up your work, and champion it. These are all very important aspects, I think, for lots of people to remember. What we're going to do is I've copied all the questions that have been asked in the chat, and I'm going to make sure that I can kind of find a way to address them, and we're going to actually post them up to our digital dissertations site, which we're going to put into, Dee just put it into the chat. The Graduate Center is trying to create a more robust guide specific to Graduate Center students, but it certainly, I think, will form as a resource for other students. This is a starting place, so we're starting to jump off, and we're going to add a lot more context and content. You can see on that website that there's one podcast already started from Matt Gold. We're going to add all of these conversations from today to that, and then we'll also be adding more conversations about program guidelines, for example, at George Mason University, and other student experiences. So I just want to say again, thank you so much to the generous sharing of time and experience from everybody here. Please feel free to unmute yourselves and give everybody a round of applause. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you at events in the future. Thank you. And as you're dropping off, for those of you that are at the Graduate Center, you should know that there is a digital dissertations group on the CUNY Academic Commons, and you're always welcome to join that to get some support as you continue your work. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye, Kay.
Bye-bye. Take care.